Okay, it's rolling.
So now in the story of Joseph, and again, it's 3 sections. If you want to divide Genesis into 3 groups, the first 11 chapters contains mostly mythological stories. That doesn't mean there's no history behind it. In fact, it's kind of funny. And you ever scroll through Google on your phone and just random stories? There was a random story yesterday about a group of scientists who have now discovered the fact that there were floods in the ancient world. Go figure. Yeah. But they put it on there like it's news. We've known this for a long time, especially at the end of the Ice Age, right? When ice melted and the sea levels rose, and there were places built on the coast that are now underwater. So again, it kind of backs up this idea that behind those myths, there is a germ of historical truth, right? There's always some historical truth behind that, but then the historical moment is used to create a larger point, right? Why do we feel things should be better than they are? Why is there evil in the world? The deep questions, right? So the first 11 chapters are set to more or less give us what we call prehistory. Why is the world the way it is? Of course, the overriding theme was once evil comes into the world, it's hard to deal with. The second section is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now there's a shift to stuff that's much more historical. You can find all the places on the map. There's no reason to doubt that those characters didn't live, right? It's hard to argue that they didn't live. The customs, the names, everything about those stories fits a particular place in history. It's still kind of vague and not immediately dateable down to the year. When you get into the monarchical period, we can date down to the year. So again, the closer you move to our time, the easier it is to date. There's more written evidence, makes it a lot easier, right? The farther back you go, the harder it is. This isn't just true in biblical studies, this is true in all ancient history studies, including the fact that you have a lot of literature that's lost because it wasn't written on the right thing and therefore didn't survive. So you've got, with the patriarchs, now you move to stories about the same guy, right? So instead of having one story about Adam and Eve, one story about Cain and Abel, one story Noah's Ark, one story Tower of Babel, now you have multiple stories about Abraham, multiple stories about Isaac, multiple stories about Jacob. But those stories are still episodic. Does everybody understand what I mean by episodic? You could rearrange the sequence in some of those stories and not really change the meaning around. Obviously, the first and the last story have to stay where they are. You'll find the same thing is true of the Gospels. So when you read the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when you read the Gospels, they're written kind of the same way. There are things that Jesus said and did, but not necessarily in the order that he said and did them. Other than the baptism has to be the beginning, and obviously the crucifixion and the resurrection has to be the end. But in the middle, we can't be sure of the sequence all the time because you have different sequences, specifically between Matthew, Mark, and Luke on one side and John on the other. Right? So we know certain things Jesus most likely said and did, but we don't know necessarily the exact order. And same thing is true of the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A lot of those things happen. Sometimes they doubled up on stories. Maybe it only happened once. With Joseph, we're now to a story where the sequence has to go the way it goes. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So whoever wrote this wrote it out in a sequence that you can't change. So that's the third section of the Old Testament. Along the way, right, you start with the first section of Genesis, is where does mankind come from? Abraham through Isaac, you're now told this is where the Hebrews come from, but this is also where the Edomites come from, Esau, This is where the Ishmaelite, the Arabs come from, Ishmael. So not only are they giving you the genealogy of the chosen people, they're also trying to give you the genealogy for all those people that lived in close proximity to them, and highlighting an interesting problem that we still have to this day. Why do we have the hardest time getting along with the people that are closest to us? Right, if you look at the world, it is interesting that sometimes the deepest prejudices, the deepest hostilities are within the same country. Right? And the Bible is just pointing out something that hasn't changed, right? But it's kind of interesting because what's it saying is, what's the cause of this? Well, the reason why the Arabs and the Jews don't get along is because years ago Ishmael was kicked out, right? And so it's a breakdown of the family causes the breakdown in the ethnic groups. They're trying to give a simple explanation as to why these groups don't. I bring this up because the Ishmaelites are going to pop up in the next story. Right? Yeah. You also have going on, there's an interesting dynamic between Israel and Egypt that's going to continue up through the actual, the problem of the Babylonian exile, where there's this kind of love-hate relationship between Israel and Egypt. At one point, they're allies, at another point, they're not allies, and it's eventually the Egyptians get the Israelites in a lot of trouble, and that's what causes the Babylonian exile. There are these shifting alliances that go on between these countries in the background as well. Now, let me explain something historical fact. The stories of Joseph. What do we know about Egyptian history during this period of time? If we're right about our dating, and Abraham lived in 1850, his grandchildren would be roughly 100 years later, they would be adults. We know that between 1750 and 1550, roughly, northern Egypt was taken over by the Canaanites. It's called, if you look it up in history, it's called the Hyksos invasion. We also know from Egyptian records that the Egyptian pharaohs were always leery of the Asians. Notice it's the Asians coming in and taking over, because I know we're not used to thinking this way, but Israel is in Southwest Asia. Syria is Southwest Asia, right? Basically, the Fertile Crescent is Southwest Asia. We're not, for some reason, people seem to forget that. So when you point out that Israel's in Asia, they go, it's not Europe? It's a long ways from Europe, actually, right? But we don't think that way. So we know from Egyptian records, there was always this fear of the Asians coming in and taking over. Now remember, part of the problem was when there's a famine in Israel, in the southern part of Canaan, the logical place for people to go for food was go across top of the Sinai Peninsula into the Delta region of Egypt, which is very lush and green, and where there rarely were famines. You would have to have the Nile not overflow in a year for them not to be able to grow their crops. That didn't happen too often. So, despite the fact that Egypt gets almost no rainfall, remember Cairo, Egypt, and Jacksonville, I told you this, on the same latitude, Jacksonville, Florida, like us, 52 inches of rain a year. Cairo, Egypt, 1 inch of rain. That's kind of stunning when you think about it. But that shows you how important the Nile River was. Right? They call Egypt the gift of the Nile for a reason. If the Nile River wasn't there, Egypt never would have existed. More than, and you can say this about a lot of riverine civilizations, but specifically Egypt, right? There's no way. There's no way, because it's the Sahara Desert, right? So ironically, it has some really rich soil because of the overflow. Anyway, we know that there was a period of time for about 200 years where the Canaanites came in to northern Egypt which is called Lower Egypt, which again goes against the way we think. We think of Lower Egypt should be in the south. But Lower Egypt's actually in the north because the Nile River flows technically in the wrong direction, like the Rhine River, like the St. John's, and the Ocklawaha. We have two rivers in Florida flow in the wrong direction. So north instead of south because it's gravity flow, right? So we know that there was a period of 200 years where the Canaanites actually were in charge of northern Egypt. So the stories of Joseph going in and becoming second in command sound really wild until you realize, oh, wait a minute, he was basically a Canaanite. It's not such a wild story because he would have been coming in at the time that the Canaanites were actually in charge of northern Egypt. We also know that after 200 years, this is Egyptian history, somewhere around the 1500s, the Egyptians that were in southern Egypt managed to come back and recapture northern Egypt. Well, what happened when they did that? The Canaanites who were in charge were either killed in battle or became slaves. When did the Israelites become slaves? Sometime during that period. Right, so the reason why I mention this is because there's a huge gap from Genesis to Exodus. There's like a 400-year gap in time where you leave Joseph and his family, you pick up the next book, Moses is being born. And you're going like, what happened, right? So we know that gap is there, but we also know something about Egyptian history that if you go from 1750 to 1550 when the Canaanites were in charge, then from 1550 to dating of Moses, roughly 1250, you got a 300-year period where the Canaanites would have been enslaved, those that survived would have been enslaved in Egypt. It fits the biblical narrative.
Dominick, were the Canaanites Jews?
Well, I'm using Canaanites in a very broad sense. I mean, if you look at Abraham's family, they lived in Canaan. I'm just using it in a broad sense, right? So, I mean, technically, Abraham wasn't a Jew until, it's when does Judaism start?
I should have said Israelites rather than Jews.
Right. Okay, but you raise a very interesting question. There's always been some question as to who were the Israelites exactly, and were the people we later call the Jews Israelites that somehow were some of them actually from Canaan, and when they conquered Canaan, they didn't kill all the Canaanites off. How much of the Canaanites did they absorb into their own population, and they became Israelites? There was probably a lot of mixing there. The Bible even alludes to that. So most scholars look at the birth of Israel. The simple story is the slaves leave Egypt and form a covenant with God. But the numbers later on are too big for just a small group of people that left. So there had to be some absorption of some Canaanites into the Israelite population. So it becomes kind of a gray area. And certainly the Egyptians, it doesn't matter who you were. If you came out of Canaan, they would have seen you as, your Asians coming in and invading our country, you're not one of us. But you do raise an important problem. There's always been some scholars who think some of the Israelites originally were Canaanites. Not all of the Israelites' ancestors came out of slavery. And here's another really interesting piece of evidence. The main Canaanite god is actually El, E-L, not Baal. Baal was considered not the father of the gods, but Baal is an important god because he's a rain god. And they needed rain in Canaan to grow their crops. It is very curious that it may be, and this gets into this whole thing of who absorbed whom. It does appear that El kind of became a secondary name for the Israelite God. if you look at the endings of proper names, Daniel, Ezekiel, the name El, El, does appear at the end of some Israelite names. Did they kind of blend El and Yahweh at one point because El was supposed to be like the main God? Was there some syncretism that they used? Am I making some sense here? Elohim, one of the four authors of the Pentateuch, is called the Elohist because he uses the word Elohim for God. So there is even some mixing and matching of names for God there. I'm not trying to, is this making some sense? It's never here's the funny thing. We all love, including myself, to have things simplified so we can understand them. But what do we all know about life? It is never that simple, right? And when we learn history, unfortunately, when we learn history, most of us learn history in a very simplified way. That's the way you have to teach it, right? But beneath the surface, it's always way more complicated than the way the history. It's like, take for example, in our own history, just as an example, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Was Abraham Lincoln pro-Negro? No. If you read history, Negro. Lincoln was very concerned once he freed the slaves, are we going to be able to keep them in this country? Or should we be trying to ship all the slaves off to Haiti or someplace else because the whites and the blacks are never going to get along? This weighed on Lincoln's mind. People think of Lincoln as the great emancipator, which he was, but that doesn't mean he totally thought, okay, now once the war's over and I freed the slaves, everything's going to be okay. Maybe we need to send all the black people away because he was, so that those nuances are important to understand in history. Why didn't Washington and Jefferson abolish slavery when they started the country? Well, you got these southern states. Are you going to keep them in the Union? If we can't keep them in the Union, are the English going to come back and just wipe us out again? Because the English did come back, right? They knew the Union. And so there's that tension between reality, how do you defend yourself, keep the Union together, even though they didn't consider slavery really a right thing, even though they owned slaves. So it's always, when you step back into history, it's always way more complicated than we think it was, and we tend to make judgments on those people based on an oversimplified view of history and think, well, we're so much better than they were, which is, of course, an absolute lie, because when you identify our own problems, we got tons of them, right? All right, anyway, back to this. So there is good historical background to this story. So people like to argue, oh, everything in the Bible is just made up. No, you can, you can see, here's history, here's where the story fits right in. If you want to argue it's all made up, the burden of proof is on the person who wants to say it's all made up. And it's just like some people used to think, well, David was somebody just made David up. And then no, they found evidence outside of Scripture that reference to the house of David. Obviously, David must have been a real person. Now, that doesn't mean every story they wrote about him is exactly true the way it's written, but there was a real character named David. So just like in these stories, these characters, no reason to doubt the characters aren't real. The situations are also very real. Does this make sense? All right. That doesn't mean, remember, keep this in mind, the stories are always written, though, to teach the religious lesson. No matter how historically accurate they may be, historical accuracy is almost never their end goal. I'm not saying they're not trying to be historically accurate, but their end goal is to teach the lesson, like Mrs. Webb pointed out a couple weeks ago. Even today, if you're impulsive, you're not going to have a good life, right? The lesson hasn't changed there. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the story of Joseph. And we see right away where Joseph, in a way, sets himself up. Probably not a good idea to brag to your brothers that daddy loves me better than everybody else, and then rub their face in it. What do you think is going to happen? right? I mean, so you kind of see this. And what's important about this is too, God doesn't work through perfect people. Because if he had to wait and work through perfect people, guess what? He would never get anything done. Because nobody's perfect. So there's a tendency to try to make saints out of these people in the Old. They weren't saints, they're just like us. Just like the saints are just like us. They overcome, though, with God's help. But they're not perfect people. Nobody is. Okay, somebody want to read? Any questions about the background? Does it make sense? Somebody want to read chapter 37 here? Start. No takers?
Joseph sold into Egypt. Jacob settled in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is his family history. When Joseph was 17 years old, he was tending the flocks with his brothers.
Now remember, Joseph and Benjamin are the only two sons of Jacob's favorite wife, that is Rachel, and she had them late. Right, they're the two youngest sons. Go ahead.
The flocks with his brothers. He was an assistant to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, and he brought his father bad reports about them.
Okay, Bilhah and Zilpah originally were the two maids of Leah and Rachel that Joseph married. So Jacob. Jacob did several things that later laws would not allow you to do. Later on in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, you can't marry two sisters. We're supposed to do that. That's something Joseph. But patriarchal period is pre-law. Right? He's following the customs of the day. The law, as we understand it, didn't exist yet. So Joseph is a tattletale. And people don't like tattletales, right? Okay, again, you're given remember, you're given this information. It's like Abraham's 75 years old. Well, why are you told that? You're told that to show how God's promise, even before it's made, doesn't look like they throw these details in that lots of times appear to be inconsequential details. They're important. Nobody liked Joseph because he's a snitch. Go ahead.
Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons, for he was a child of his old age, and he made him a long tunic.
This is the famous coat of many colors. So he's given a special code signifying Daddy loves him best, which doesn't help Joseph's relationship with his brothers. Go ahead.
When his brothers saw that their father loved him best of all his sons, they hated him so much that they would not even greet him. Once Joseph had a dream, which he told to his brothers. Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose to an upright position, and your sheaves formed a ring around my sheaf and bowed down to it.
Okay, everybody understands what a sheaf is? Yes? If you don't know, please say so.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, when you harvest grain, here's the problem with grain. So we don't grow wheat here. The only grain we grow pretty much is corn, because you can grow it in a wet climate. But wheat and barley and those grains can't handle moisture. So when you harvest the grain, right, you come in with a scythe and you cut it down, it lays over. You don't want the seed head to get wet. That's why they bound them into sheaves, so you can stand them up and lean them up against each other, and then you get them out of the field as quickly as possible. Because if you get a heavy dew or rain on that, you can get a fungal organism. Basically, your crop is ruined. So when you harvest grain, no fooling around. And you see in our country, where in the Midwest, where they grow the wheat and the barley and all that, you have these mechanical harvests that come through, bundle it all up, and you can't. In fact, at harvest time, later on when the Israelites become farmers in Canaan, During harvest time, they would spend the night out in the fields in tents, so that you're not wasting it. Most people, unlike in the United States, where we think of a farmer living on his property. But in Israel, everybody lived in small villages, in the foothills, not on the farmland. You don't want to waste good farmland. So when they harvested, it appears that they would spend the night in the fields. To save the time of walking back and forth, it's you get the grain cut faster, you get it bundled faster. And of course, once you bundle in the sheaves, the problem is it's easy to steal. So you spend the night out, all right, with your crop, then you get it in undercover as soon as possible. So a sheaf is a bundle of, you've seen pictures. It's a bundle of wheat or barley. Okay, go ahead.
Are you really going to make yourself king over us, his brothers asked him, or impose your rule on us? So they hated him all the more because of his talk about his dream.
So again, Joseph, you can have the dream, but do you have to tell everybody? You have to brag about it, you know. So in some ways, Joseph and Jacob, right, are accomplices in this problem that's created. Okay, the other thing about this that's important is, again, fast forward to the New Testament. In Matthew's Gospel, only Matthew and Luke have infancy stories. Mark and John don't. In Matthew's infancy stories, angels always appear to Joseph in a dream. In Luke's Gospel, the angel appears directly to Mary. But in Matthew, the angel always appears to Joseph in a dream. In a subtle way, is Matthew trying to link Jesus' father to Joseph in the Old Testament, because Joseph in the Old Testament is somebody known for dreams. Now again, we know that Matthew was written to a Jewish Christian audience. And the other three Gospels were more than likely written to Gentile audiences. So what makes us say this, number one, if you read through Matthew's Gospel, he's loaded with Old Testament quotes. I mean, quotes the Old Testament ad nauseum. Whereas the other guys, every once in a while, will quote the Old Testament or will make references that are more veiled. But Matthew just dumps Old Testament quotes on you all the time. So it looks like Matthew's written to an audience that knew the Old Testament. Otherwise, why quote the Old Testament so much? And so it looks like Matthew is deliberately, when he writes, trying to make as many connections between Jesus and Old Testament characters as possible. Because the more connections he makes, the more comfortable his audience will feel that Jesus really is from Jewish heritage. His roots are solidly Jewish. Am I making sense here? So it could be that Matthew is using these stories in his infancy there, because the only dream sequences in Matthew's Gospel are in the infancy narratives, and they're almost always related to Joseph, and Joseph in the Old Testament was known for somebody who not only had dreams, but interpretation is the key, because the fact that he can interpret dreams is a sign God has to be with him. So as these stories continue, as his fortunes seem to get worse and worse and worse, there's always in the background this idea he can always interpret dreams. Therefore, God has never really abandoned Joseph. He's always there. It makes you wonder, then why are his fortunes decreasing? And in the very end, you find out why his fortunes were decreasing. But the fact that he can always interpret dreams means God is still with him. God hasn't abandoned him. Because in the ancient world, if you can interpret dreams, it was a sign that your God must be with you. That was commonly, but remember, they were very superstitious. It was a common belief in the ancient world. So the fact that he has dreams is one thing. The fact that he can interpret dreams is actually more important, because he has the ability to interpret dreams that aren't even his. Interpretation is more critical than the dream itself. Does that make sense? The ability to interpret is the critical gift to have. Okay, So I'm gonna pick up verse 9.
Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Look, I had another dream, he said. This time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told it to his father and his brothers reproved him and asked, What is the meaning of this dream of yours? Can it be that I and your mother and your brothers are to come and bow to the ground before you? So his brothers were furious at him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
Okay, so again, now it's not just the brothers, but and of course this is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen. Eventually the family is going to come into Egypt, and they will be bowing down to him because they don't even know it's him, actually. They think he's dead. So, spoiler alert. Notice how often in the Bible they give away the ending right at the beginning of the story. One way or another, they give away the ending, right? The people of the Tower of Babel. Gee, we better build this tower while we still speak the same language. You know, like Pharaoh. Gee, we better kill off all the Israelite males, otherwise they're going to escape. And that's, they give away the ending of the story. So, okay. You want to keep going there?
Sure. One day when his brothers had gone to pasture, their father's flocks at Shechem, Israel, said to Joseph, Are your brothers not tending our flocks at Shechem? Come and I will send you to them. I am ready, Joseph answered. Go then, he replied. See if all is well with your brothers and the flocks, and we bring back word.
And we know that part of the problem of being a shepherd is you got to move, right? Because the sheep eat the grass down. There's nothing unusual about this. You got to move from pasture to pasture, and it's a rough life. That's why shepherds, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all lived in tents. You got to be able to pick up. You may have a home base, but you got to be prepared to move around. Otherwise, you will lose your flock. Go ahead.
So he sent him off from the valley of Hebron.
Now, Hebron is south of Jerusalem. Shechem is just north of Jerusalem. So it's not like an hour later he comes to Shechem, right? He goes through the hill country to get up to Shechem, which is north of the hill country.
When Joseph reached Shechem, a man came upon him as he was wandering about in the fields. What are you looking for? The man asked him. I am looking for my brothers, he answered. Please tell me where they are tending the flocks. The man told him, They have moved on from here. In fact, I heard them say, Let them go on to Dothan.
And that's not in Alabama. Everybody knows there is a Dothan, Alabama, right?
No.
If you go through the South, it's very interesting how many cities and or places are named after biblical.
Didn't know that.
There's a ton. That's why they call it the Bible Belt. Yeah, good point. There's forests. There's the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, which is named after a forest. And yeah.
So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Then they saw him from a distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns here. We could say that a wild beast devoured him. We will see then what comes of his dreams.
Okay, does everybody know what a cistern is?
Yes.
Yes? It's not a well,
No.
but it is a place to hold water.
Yeah, just a big.
So that the problem in Israel is the farther south you go, the less rainfall. So capturing rainwater and being able to hold it in a place where it wouldn't evaporate was really important, because you have a few wells, but when the rainy season came, they could run rivers into these cisterns and fill them up with water. And even though the water's sitting there for a long time, it's better than no water at all.
Right.
So they would go dry. By the time you get to the end of the dry season, the cisterns were actually usually pretty dry. And there were some of these were huge. There's the fortress called Masada that's near the Dead Sea. That's basically a flattened, it's like a butte, it's a flattened mountain where Herod the Great built a fortress where the Jews held out against the Romans for 3 months, and dug into that mountain is this just gigantic. A lot of times they would take a cave and enlarge it and then plaster the walls. And then when the rainy season, they would divert water into that area. So cisterns are common in that part of the world, in the ancient world.
But when Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from their hands, saying, "We must not take his life." Then Reuben said, "Do not shed blood. Throw him into this cistern in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." His purpose was to save him from their hands and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic, the long ornamented tunic he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming.
Okay, Ishmaelites,
Yeah.
the descendants of
Ishmael.
Ishmael. Remember, he is the father of the Arabs. It's a caravan
Yes.
of traders. Again, there was a whole network of trading routes in the ancient Near East. This is perfectly plausible.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Then they sat down to eat. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels laden with gum, balm, and resin to be taken down to Egypt.
The ingredients for incense.
Judah said,
Incense now was, at that time, like salt, incense was very valuable. Right, salt's valuable because you could use salt to salt meat and fish and preserve it, because it didn't have refrigeration. So salt was a very valuable commodity all the way up through early Roman Empire. Sometimes they paid their legions in salt instead of in money, because that's how valuable salt was, so they could barter the salt to buy other. So the English word salary actually comes from the word salt, which is, that's how, we don't think of salt as that critically valuable. Now we look at salt as it gives you high blood pressure. Don't eat too much salt, right? But back then, salt was, and that's why in the New Testament you find those sayings about the salt of the earth, because it's not just something that makes food taste good, it's something that you needed really to help you preserve food. So it was very valuable. And like with the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? Everybody thinks of, oh, gold was a really expensive gift. Well, so was frankincense, because incense was really expensive, because you make incense, it comes off the gum off this tree in Arabia, and then the traders bring it around, and they sell it off. So it's a valuable commodity.
Judah said to his brothers, "What is to be gained by killing your brother and concealing his blood?"
Okay, stop. Notice which brother this is? Judah. Guess what tribe David is from?
Judah.
The tribe of Judah. Later in history, the tribe of Judah will emerge as like the lone surviving tribe. When David and Solomon are the tribe of Judah. When the kingdom splits after Solomon dies in 921, the southern kingdom is known as the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom was known as the kingdom of Israel. The whole thing was Israel at one point, right? But when they split, Judah becomes the name, and it's from the tribe of Judah that the Messiah is supposed to come from, because David is of the tribe of Judah, and the word Jew actually eventually comes from that name. Once the tribe of Judah, or some of them, are taken in exile in Babylon, that's where the word Jew comes from. So it's not an accident that Judah is the one who devises a plot to save his brother. That would explain why later on Judah emerges as the most important tribe. Because remember, this is written after the fact that Judah is the tribe of David. This is all written after that.
Well, Reuben tried to.
Reuben tries first, but Judah's the one who actually, and then later, when you get to the end of the story, Judah's going to step in again and say, take me instead of So Judah kind of is given several opportunities to rise to the top. And again, it's a subtle way of explaining why later on the tribe of Judah seems more favored than the others. But you're right, Reuben is the first one that tries to stop the killing. Go ahead.
Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, instead of doing away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh, his brothers agreed. Midianite traders passed by, and they pulled Joseph up.
Oh, wait. Midianites?
That's what it says in here.
That's what it says in mine.
That's what it says in mine too. First it's Ishmaelites, now it's Midianites.
Oh, they keep changing.
Because this is evidence that the story probably circulated more than one version.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Now, it just so happens that the Midianites are another group of desert nomads. Later on, when Moses goes into the Sinai Peninsula after he escapes from Egypt, because he kills the guy, he marries a girl who is a Midianite. So these are both, they have something in common in the sense that they're desert dwellers. These are tribes that live in the desert. And in tents, and we're shepherds and we're traders. So the fact that it jumps from one to the other, it's kind of like two sets of directions in the Noah's Ark story, right? Again, it's another piece of evidence that the story probably existed in more than one version, and the person writing it down is kind of blending it all together, and what seems like an obvious contradiction to us didn't matter to them. So,
Midianite traders passed by, and they pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt.
So back to the Ishmaelites.
Two tribes when we were.
Yeah. When Reuben went back to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not in it, he tore his garments, and returning to his brothers, he explained, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" They took Joseph's tunic, and after slaughtering a goat, dipped the tunic in its blood. Then they sent someone to bring the long ornamented tunic to their father with this message: "We found this. See whether it is your son's tunic or not." He recognized it and explained, "My son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him."
Now remember, at this time, there are lions,
Oh, yeah.
bears, in it. Animals that are not there now, were there then.
Yeah.
We know this. So it was they existed.
Yeah.
Wolves, bears, so go ahead.
Joseph had been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son many days.
And we'll see this a lot in the Old Testament. When you went in the morning, you tore your clothes. Sometimes they talk about throwing dust on their heads. That's easy to understand. The dust you shall return, right? The tearing of the clothes, I'm not quite sure what that means, but you'll see it over and over again in stories. When David finds out that Saul was killed, he tears his garments. There's tons of stories where the person, upon hearing the bad news, tears their garments, throws dust on their head. It's a sign of mourning. Go ahead.
Though his sons and daughters tried to console him, he refused all consolation, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son and Sheol." Thus did his father weep for him. The Midianites, meanwhile, sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and his chief steward.
Okay. Here's the problem with both Genesis and Exodus. They talk about Pharaoh, but they never name who the Pharaoh is. If they had just one time given us a name, we'd have a better way of dating, right? But they just say Pharaoh, and all the stories in the story with Abraham, they say Pharaoh. Here they say Pharaoh again. With Moses, they say Pharaoh. So unfortunately, had they just slipped the name in there, we could go, because we know the Egyptian records And we know what Pharaoh lived roughly when. It would make life a lot easier, but no, don't give us a name. So, the assumption here would be, if you don't know the Hyksos had invaded Egypt, the assumption here would be that the Pharaoh is a normal Egyptian Pharaoh. But that assumption would be wrong. That by this time, the Canaanites probably were in charge in northern Egypt. So that when Joseph gets sold into slavery, he's not being sold into slavery to what we would consider normal Egyptians. He's being sold into slavery to people that were probably more of his own ilk. Not that that mattered. Okay? So Joseph's fortunes turn bad. Although he's alive. Right? Okay. Then chapter 38, you have this weird story about Judah and Tamar, which is kind of plunked in there. You could take it out and go to chapter 39, and you can see where the story picks right up. Everybody see that? Same thing you find in the Gospels. There's tons of places in the Gospels where you're reading along. Probably one of the most best place examples is Mark. Jesus sends out the 12 in pairs. Go and preach, drive out demons, cure the ill. If people don't accept you, shake the dust off your feet. And then all of a sudden you're in a story about John the Baptist. Now John the Baptist is killed. And then when the story about John the Baptist being killed is over, the apostles come back to Jesus, but Jesus isn't in the story where John the Baptist is killed. It's just the story's kind of put in there as a middle thing between the time Jesus sends the disciples out until they come back. Has really nothing to do with. You could take the story of John the Baptist out of that chapter and put it somewhere else, and the chapter would flow perfectly. Which again shows us that the way the Gospels are written is that gospel writers had stories about Jesus, but not necessarily did they have the sequence of stories happening. Other than the beginning and the end, are obviously you can't change that, right? Everybody has it, right? But in the middle, they were free to arrange the sequence in some way that made sense to them to make their point, because the original sequence might have been lost to them. In other words, because they weren't really eyewitnesses themselves. That doesn't mean it's not inspired, it just means that that's the way they were written. Okay, so chapter 39. So I'm going to pick that up.
When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, an Egyptian Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, and his chief steward, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there.
So again, it just picks right up, right? Logical, makes sense. Go ahead.
The Lord was with Joseph, and he enjoyed great success, and was assigned to the household of his Egyptian master.
Okay, why did they have to tell you the Lord was with Joseph? Why did they throw that in there?
Well, he was having good luck.
He was having good, despite the fact he's now a slave in a foreign land. That doesn't mean God has abandoned him, right? His luck, from the outside, his luck doesn't look too good, right? So you're reminded, well, hey, wait a minute. God really is still with him. Don't worry. Does it make sense? Okay, go ahead.
When his master saw that the Lord was with him and brought him success in whatever he did, he favored Joseph and made him his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his household and entrusted to him all his possessions. From the moment that he put him in charge of his household and all his possessions, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The Lord's blessing was on everything he owned, both inside the house and out.
Okay, again, that's the whole idea that if you're good, God rewards you here and now. If you're bad, you're punished here and now. Everything happens in this life. Their concept of the netherworld, like, Jacob talking about, I'm going to go to the netherworld or the pit or Sheol. Those three words are used interchangeably. no one knew what happened there. When you read the book of Job, probably the most complete description of another world you find in the book of Job, and all they basically tell you is like when everybody dies, everybody kind of goes into the deep freeze. You're just there. There's no sense of, you're at peace, but there's no heaven or hell. You're just kind of, everybody's in the same place. So they had this, in a way they believed there was life after death, but they didn't have a sense of what happens after that. This is the important life. Right? What happens to you here is what's important. They're just, later on, we don't die, but also we're not rewarded or punished. It's not until after the exile they start to develop then what does happen after death. Does this make sense? So it's their concept of life after death in this period is very vague. All their eggs are in this basket, this life. You're rewarded or punished here. So if you're a barren woman, you must have done something wrong. If you're poor, if you're sick, if you die young, somebody did something wrong. If you're wealthy, have a lot of children, long, healthy life, that's got to be a reward from God. You must be doing something right. Now to us, this sounds kind of silly, but that's how they thought until the book of Job. And then Job kind of pulls the rug out from under that whole idea. Okay, so when you're told in these early stories that somebody's having a lot, like you're going to be told this in Exodus, despite that the Hebrews are enslaved, which is bad, they're having a lot of kids. That's a subtle way of saying God has not abandoned them because they're having a lot of children. So what, on the surface it looks bad, but if you analyze it, no, God's still there, right? You're given these details because it was a sign that God was still with them. Because as we look at the story, things are not going well. Right? He's now a slave. Am I making sense? All right, go ahead.
Having left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, he gave no thought when Joseph was there to anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was...
Of course, this then sets up what? Who's going to put Joseph in charge later on?
Pharaoh.
The Pharaoh. So you're told, well, okay. In a way, it's like character development, right?
Yeah.
Esau, you're told, versus Jacob. Jacob may be the mama's boy, but he's a thinker, and he's not impulsive. Joseph's talent is, he's a good manager. And he's a good manager. So he will be elevated later on to manage the whole country, at least the northern part, right? But you're kind of given that, you're shown his management skills here. His master trusts him so much, he puts him in charge. Go ahead.
Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After a time, his master's wife looked at him with longing and said, "Lie with me." But he refused.
Of course, everybody knows that means have sex. Go ahead.
But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, as long as I am here, my master does not give a thought to anything in this house, but has entrusted to me all he owns. He has no more authority in this house than I do. He has withheld from me nothing but you, since you are his wife. How then could I do this great wrong and sin against God?" Although she spoke to him day after day, he would not agree to lie with her or even be near her. One such day, when Joseph came into the household to do his work, and none of the household servants were then in the house, she laid hold of him by his cloak, saying, "Lie with me." But leaving the cloak in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand, as he escaped outside, she cried out to her household servants and told them, "Look, my husband has brought us a Hebrew man to mock us. He came in here to lie with me, but I cried out loudly. When he heard me scream, he left his cloak beside me and escaped and ran outside.
By the way, Hebrew, the word Hebrew, this is interesting. They think the word Hebrew is derived from the word apiru, which means outlaw. Because at one time, when you think about it, the Hebrew slaves escaping from Egypt, you have this motley crew, right? They leave Egypt and they travel through various lands to get to Canaan. And so they look like a group of outlaws. They're literally outside the law of these other countries. Go ahead.
She kept the cloak with her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. The Hebrew slave whom you brought us came to me to amuse himself at my expense. But when I screamed, he left his cloak beside me and escaped outside. When the master heard his wife's story in which she reported, "Thus, and so your servant did to me," he became enraged. Joseph's master seized him and put him into the jail where the king's prisoners were confined, and there he sat in jail.
There's an interesting story. This is kind of a weird connection. In Mark's gospel, Mark is the only one that has this. When Jesus is arrested, the disciples immediately run away. And there's this curious story about a young man who somebody grabs a hold of him, and they grab his garment, and he runs away naked. Only Mark has that story, so we don't know the exact, did it really happen? Why don't the other guys have it? You know, it's kind of a weird story. Some wonder, is Mark kind of playing off of this story where Joseph runs away? He doesn't say he runs away naked, but his garment. So is he trying to make a tie to the Old Testament? It's kind of one of those curious, the story's there, nobody's quite sure how to interpret it. Symbolically, it could be interpreted as, if you run away from Jesus, you lose all your dignity. Because that's what the apostles have just done when he's arrested, right? They literally run away and they leave him abandoned. That's not how it's written in the other three Gospels. That's how it's written in Mark's Gospel. So sometimes you wonder, is there a tie-in here? Okay, what happens to him?
The chief jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners in the jail. I skipped something.
That's okay.
But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness by making the chief jailer well disposed toward him.
So again, why are you told us? As Joseph's fortunes continue to sink, you're reminded God's still with him. It doesn't look like it though. From the outside, anybody judging this would think, wow, this guy is really falling out of favor because look at all the bad things that are happening to him. Go ahead.
The chief jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners in the jail. Everything that had to be done there, he was the one to do it. The chief jailer did not have to look after anything that was in Joseph's charge, since the Lord was with him and was bringing success to whatever he was doing.
So again, as Joseph's a good organizer, a good manager, but the reason why he's a good organizer is because God is with him, right? So you're constantly reminded, as his fortunes seem to sink, they're not sinking. This is all to set up the final story. It's kind of like the story of Abraham, kind of leading you on, right? As Abraham gets older, it looks like the promise can be fulfilled, and then it is fulfilled when it's no longer possible, and then God says, kill the kid. In some ways, this story is written to set up the suspense. Joseph seems to be doing worse and worse. But in the end, everything, of course, is going to turn out marvelously. Okay, it's 10 to 10. I know some people have to go. So we'll pick it up. The 40 and 41, right? These are pretty famous stories. These chapters get really long. 40, 41, and 42. And you'll notice again, the sequence has to happen this way, right? He has to be sold into slavery in order to go to Potiphar's. To go to Potiphar's, he then ends up in jail. When he ends up in jail, then he interprets a dream and that's how he ends up interpreting Pharaoh's dream, because you can't mess, the sequence has got to go that way, right? It doesn't make sense to, you can't jumble it around. Any questions? No?
No, this is the interesting part.
Right. It is the interesting part. All right, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Father, we thank you for this day, for all the great things you've done for us, for again helping us to understand, as we look at the characters in the Old Testament, to understand that they're flawed just like we're flawed. But their secret is those that allow you to work in their lives end up with good lives. And those who reject you working in their lives don't end up so well. So help us to, despite our flaws, be open to your grace, working in our own lives to perfect us as you see fit. And we ask you to bless us all through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. I just want to say one thing about today's readings Father read. That, when you think about the second half, husbands have to be, well, like Christ. So what does that mean?
Lay down their lives.
You have to die for your wife. Well, how does Christ show his love for the church? He dies. So it's interesting that even in a highly patriarchal society, where it's wise to be submissive to your husband, Paul actually is very balanced there in the sense that he's showing, look, it's not going to work unless you're like Christ. Well, what does that mean? You have to sacrifice yourself. So even though it says wise to be submissive, it's you better be listening to your wife and doing what she needs, otherwise you're not being like Jesus. So the men really are not off the hook in that reading.
No, in fact, they get the tougher role.
They do, yeah, but we have a tendency, because the word be submissive to your husband is so jarring.
The very last line, though, is the one that's good. Women respect your husband.
Yeah, yeah,
That's it. If they had used respect instead of submit,
yeah,
there would never have been a problem.
right,
Because if you see in any marriage that's successful,
sure,
there has to be respect
yeah,
between the two people.
yeah.
There has to be.
But it goes to show you, despite the prejudice of the culture of the day, the advice is, you better be like Christ to your wife.
And a lot of people don't read the whole thing.
No, they don't read the whole
They
thing.
quit.
Yeah, they quit a wise be submissive to your husband. And that's, he says that twice. The second time there's and I can't remember which letter it's in. Then he goes on to talk about how you treat your children. Don't be overly severe with your children.
That's a good one where it says, fathers, do not make your sons lose heart.
Right, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
Incredible statement.
That's what it means, don't be overly,
Yeah.
because back then, children had no rights. At all. You know, in the Greco-Roman world, the father could say, I don't want this child, when it's born, put it on the doorstep. That was brutal. That's why in the Didache, you have the teaching about infanticide and abortion. In the Didache, basically the first catechism, supposedly written about 100, because abortion and infanticide was practiced. But the father could say, because kids had, so when Jesus says, be like a little child, he doesn't mean be innocent, because all of us that have had kids realize little kids aren't always so innocent, but the concept of be like a little child was children were totally dependent on their parents for their life. So when Jesus says be like a child, be dependent on God, which makes sense when you think of it, right? That it fits the rest of his message. It doesn't mean you're going to be innocent, it means be dependent. But that's another passage that's often misconstrued, because we don't know how children were treated back then compared to now. There was no, government agency that went in and said, we're taking the kids away. That just didn't exist. So, all right. See y'all next week. Hopefully this taping worked.